My phone buzzed at 12:15 a.m. with Whitney's name lighting up the screen, and I already knew what kind of night this was going to be. I'd been asleep for exactly 47 minutes after a brutal 14-hour day coordinating the water main replacement project on 5th Street, dealing with everything from permit delays to angry residents whose driveways we'd temporarily blocked, plus an emergency meeting with the environmental compliance officer about soil contamination levels that threatened to push our timeline back another 3 weeks. I answered on the third ring, and Whitney's voice came through the speaker like a broken faucet, all hiccups and desperate gasps about how Derek had completely ghosted her after their 4th date, and she was having a complete mental breakdown in her kitchen surrounded by the organic smoothie ingredients he'd recommended for her post-workout recovery routine. Derek was this personal trainer she'd met at spin class 2 weeks ago, the kind of guy who posted shirtless mirror selfies with motivational quotes about grinding and hustling, had tribal tattoos covering his biceps, and drove a lifted truck with custom rims that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. I sat up in bed, my back still aching from hunching over blueprints for the past 6 hours, already calculating the drive time to her apartment while she sobbed about how they'd had such an amazing connection and she just couldn't understand why he'd stopped responding to her texts after their Tuesday night dinner at that trendy farm-to-table restaurant where they talked about his dreams of opening his own boutique fitness studio specializing in high-intensity functional movement training. The thing about Whitney's crisis calls was that they always required physical presence, comfort food, and at least 3 hours of detailed analysis about every single interaction she'd had with whatever guy had disappointed her this time, complete with screenshots, timeline reconstruction, and exhaustive discussion about what each emoji might have meant in context. I threw on clothes and drove across town to the 24-hour diner we'd been going to since college, ordering her usual chocolate chip cookies, extra-large coffee with 2 sugars, and a slice of their famous apple pie because I knew she'd need the full comfort food arsenal for whatever emotional excavation we were about to undertake. She met me at the door in her matching pajama set and yesterday's mascara streaked down her cheeks like war paint, immediately launching into a play-by-play of their last conversation while devouring the cookies like they contain the answers to all of life's mysteries and checking her phone every 30 seconds to see if Derek had miraculously decided to resurrect their relationship with a late-night apology text. I listened to her dissect every text message, every social media like, every moment of eye contact during their Tuesday night dinner, every laugh he'd given to her jokes about her marketing job at the wellness center, and the exact tone he'd used when he'd said he had a really nice time and would definitely call her soon, while part of my brain calculated how exhausted I'd be tomorrow when I had to present the infrastructure budget to the city council and explain why we needed an additional $2 million to upgrade the storm drainage system before next year's flooding season. After 2 hours of this emotional archaeology, during which Whitney had consumed both cookies and half the pie while pacing around her living room like a detective trying to solve a murder case, she finally collapsed on her couch and looked at me with those big grateful eyes that I'd seen 100 times before, telling me that I was like the brother she never had, the one person she could always count on to understand her heart and help her make sense of these confusing situations with guys who just didn't seem to appreciate what an amazing, caring, intelligent woman she was. That phrase hit me like a cold slap of reality, and I realized this wasn't the first time I'd heard it, not even close to the first time, because in fact it had become my official title in Whitney's life over the past 6 years, a prison sentence disguised as a compliment that defined my role as her perpetual emotional cleanup crew, always available to sweep up the mess left behind by the exciting guys who actually got to kiss her goodnight, hold her hand in public, and wake up next to her on Sunday mornings instead of getting middle-of-the-night phone calls about their latest disappearing act. Sitting there in her dimly lit living room at nearly 3 in the morning, watching her scroll through Derek's Instagram posts for the 15th time while analyzing whether his recent story about pre-workout supplements contained any hidden messages about their relationship status, I felt something shift inside my chest like a gear finally clicking into place after years of grinding against the wrong mechanism. I'd driven across town on a work night, brought her favorite comfort food, listened to her emotional spiral with the patience of a professional therapist, and held her hand while she cried about another guy who'd treated her like a temporary entertainment option, and my reward was being told that I filled the exact same role as a family member, Someone safe and reliable and completely removed from any possibility of romantic consideration. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent more time in the past 6 months listening to Whitney's relationship problems than most married couples spend discussing their actual relationships, and yet she saw me as so fundamentally unsuitable for romance that the idea had apparently never crossed her mind even once during our hundreds of late-night conversations. I watched her finally fall asleep on the couch clutching her phone like a security blanket, her face peaceful for the first time in hours, and I covered her with the throw blanket she kept draped over her chair specifically for these post-crisis crashes. As I drove home through the empty streets, my headlights cutting through the darkness while my exhausted brain tried to process the evening's events, I realized that this pattern had been repeating itself for years with different guys but the same fundamental dynamic, me serving as Whitney's emotional baseline while she explored the exciting possibilities offered by men who saw her as an actual woman instead of a sister figure. And I started to wonder what would happen if the brother she never had simply stopped answering the phone at midnight and started living his own life for once instead of constantly managing hers. The Derek crisis faded into memory within 2 weeks, replaced by Whitney's excitement about her latest dating app discovery, but what stuck with me was the growing realization that I'd been living the same exhausting cycle for 6 years without ever questioning my role in this one-sided emotional economy. I started mentally cataloging all the nights I'd dropped everything to rush to Whitney's aid, remembering the time she'd called me sobbing at 11 p.m. because Marcus, the bartender from that upscale cocktail lounge, had left her birthday party early to work a private event, and I'd spent 3 hours convincing her that his departure wasn't a personal rejection but a professional obligation. Then there was the weekend she discovered that Trevor, the yoga instructor with the man bun and expensive meditation retreats, had been posting photos with another woman on his Instagram stories, leading to a 48-hour emotional investigation that required my presence for moral support while she analyzed every pixel of those images for clues about the nature of their relationship. I realized I could map out my entire social calendar for the past 6 years based on Whitney's romantic disasters, each crisis demanding immediate attention and consuming entire evenings that I could have spent advancing my own career, pursuing my own interests, or building relationships with people who saw me as more than an emotional maintenance crew. The irony became even sharper when I thought about my recent promotion to senior project manager, an achievement I'd worked toward for 3 years through night classes, additional certifications, and managing increasingly complex infrastructure projects that required coordination between multiple city departments, contractors, and community stakeholders. I'd planned a celebration dinner at that new steakhouse downtown, the one with the excellent wine list and the chef who'd trained in France, thinking it would be nice to share this milestone with someone who'd been such a constant presence in my life. Whitney had agreed enthusiastically, even suggested we make reservations for 7:30 so she could finish her evening yoga class, and I'd looked forward to finally having a conversation that centered around my accomplishments and future goals instead of dissecting someone else's dating behavior. But within 10 minutes of sitting down at our table, after I'd mentioned the promotion and the salary increase that came with it, Whitney completely derailed the conversation to obsess over her newest match on some premium dating app called Raya, a freelance photographer named Jackson who apparently wrote poetry about urban landscapes and had connections in the local art scene. She'd pulled out her phone to show me his profile while our appetizers sat untouched, scrolling through his carefully curated Instagram feed filled with moody black and white photographs of abandoned buildings and cryptic captions about finding beauty in decay and transformation. The way she talked about him was completely different from her usual dating excitement, describing his artistic soul and creative vision like she'd discovered some rare specimen of masculinity that existed on a higher plane than ordinary men. And when she mentioned that he'd invited her to an underground gallery opening in the warehouse district, her eyes lit up with the kind of genuine enthusiasm I'd never seen her direct toward my engineering projects or municipal planning achievements. What really stung was her casual dismissal of my profession and personality, referring to me as one of those predictable engineering types who thinks in spreadsheets and blueprints while completely missing the poetry and passion that makes life worth living. A comment delivered with the kind of affectionate condescension usually reserved for explaining simple concepts to children. She spent the entire dinner describing Jackson's latest photography series about gentrification and displacement, his philosophy about art as social commentary, and his ability to see the hidden stories embedded in urban architecture. While I sat there realizing that my actual expertise in urban planning and infrastructure development apparently qualified as boring technical knowledge rather than meaningful contribution to the community. By the time we finished dessert, I understood that Whitney used me as her benchmark for boring stability, the reliable baseline against which she measured the excitement and unpredictability offered by men like Jackson, and that my role in her life was essentially to provide a launching pad from which she could reach toward more thrilling but ultimately unsustainable relationships with guys who made her feel like the main character in some romantic adventure rather than a supporting player in someone else's practical, well-planned life. The Jackson obsession continued for 3 weeks, during which Whitney provided daily updates about his artistic insights, their deep conversations about the intersection of photography and social justice, and his mysterious reluctance to define their relationship despite their obvious spiritual connection. But something had shifted inside me during that celebration dinner, and I found myself calculating the perfect moment to finally speak the truth that had been building in my chest for years. I chose our regular Saturday morning coffee ritual at the downtown cafe we'd been frequenting since college, the place with the exposed brick walls and local art displays that Whitney always claimed inspired her creativity, thinking that familiar surroundings might make the conversation feel less like an ambush and more like a natural evolution of our friendship into something deeper and more meaningful. She arrived 20 minutes late, which had become her standard operating procedure since meeting Jackson, bubbling with excitement about his latest Instagram poetry post that apparently captured the essence of urban loneliness through a photograph of rain-soaked pavement and a caption about how water reveals the hidden cracks in concrete just like love exposes the vulnerabilities in human hearts. I listened to her read the entire post aloud while she stirred sugar into her lavender latte, watching her face light up with the kind of genuine admiration I'd been hoping to inspire for the past 6 years, and I realized that this moment represented my last real opportunity to change the fundamental dynamic between us before it calcified into permanent friend zone imprisonment. I waited for her to finish analyzing the deeper meaning behind Jackson's artistic vision, then took a breath that felt like jumping off a cliff and told her that I needed to discuss something important about our friendship, something that had been weighing on my mind for longer than I cared to admit. Her expression immediately shifted to concerned friend mode, the same look she'd worn during every crisis call over the years, and she reached across the table to squeeze my hand while assuring me that I could tell her anything because we were practically family and she would always be there to support me through whatever was troubling my heart. The irony of her calling us family in the exact moment I was preparing to confess romantic feelings was so perfect it almost made me laugh. But instead I pressed forward and explained that being called her brother and treated like emotional support personnel was actually painful for me because my feelings for her had never been purely platonic. I told her that I'd been in love with her since our 2nd year of friendship, that every crisis call and emergency comfort session had been motivated by hope that she might eventually see me as someone capable of providing the excitement and passion she sought in other relationships, and that watching her date a parade of guys who treated her carelessly while dismissing me as safe and predictable had become genuinely heartbreaking. Whitney's face went through a complicated series of expressions, starting with surprise, moving through what looked like panic, and finally settling into the kind of patient, gentle expression people use when they're about to deliver devastating news with maximum compassion. She explained that our bond was sacred to her, too precious and important to risk destroying with the complications and potential messiness that came with romantic relationships, and that she felt completely secure with me precisely because our connection existed above the shallow physical attraction and emotional turbulence that characterized her dating life. The way she described it, I represented stability and unconditional support while guys like Jackson offered excitement and butterflies, and she couldn't understand why I would want to jeopardize the beautiful thing we already had by introducing romantic expectations that might ruin everything if things didn't work out between us. She talked about our friendship like it was some kind of precious artifact that needed to be preserved in its current form, protected from the destructive forces of sexual tension and relationship drama that had supposedly ruined so many other meaningful connections throughout history. I sat there listening to her explain why loving me would be a terrible mistake, how she valued our emotional intimacy too much to risk losing it, and how she needed at least one relationship in her life that remained uncomplicated by romantic pressure or physical desire, And I realized that Whitney had constructed an entire philosophical framework designed to justify keeping me in the exact role that served her emotional needs while protecting her from having to consider me as an actual romantic option. When she finished her careful, compassionate rejection, she smiled at me with such genuine affection that I could see how much she truly cared about preserving what we had, and she told me that she felt butterflies with guys like Jackson but complete security with me, which was exactly why our friendship was so special and irreplaceable in her life. I drove home from that coffee shop conversation with a clarity I hadn't experienced in years, understanding finally that Whitney would never see me as anything more than her emotional security blanket, and instead of wallowing in the rejection or trying to convince her to reconsider, I made a decision that felt like the first genuinely adult choice I'd made in our entire relationship. That afternoon, I methodically blocked Whitney across every platform we'd ever used to communicate, starting with her phone number, then moving through Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, the meditation app where we'd connected our progress, even LinkedIn and Venmo, creating a complete digital barrier that would prevent her from reaching me through any channel she'd grown accustomed to using for her crisis management needs. I felt no anger or desire for revenge, just a profound sense of relief that reminded me of finally setting down heavy luggage after carrying it for too long, and I realized that 6 years of being someone's unpaid therapist had conditioned me to feel guilty about prioritizing my own emotional well-being over her constant need for validation and support. For the first time since college, my phone remained silent in the evenings, no midnight crisis calls interrupting my sleep or weekend plans getting derailed by emergency emotional support sessions, and I discovered that I actually enjoyed the quiet consistency of coming home to my own space without wondering when the next dramatic interruption would arrive. I threw myself into the projects and hobbies I'd been neglecting during my years of Whitney management, signing up for a woodworking class at the community center where I learned to build furniture with my hands instead of just designing infrastructure on computer screens, and I started taking astronomy photography courses that required driving to dark sky locations outside the city, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for when my evenings belonged to someone else's. Relationship drama. The woodworking shop became my sanctuary, a place where I could focus on creating something tangible and beautiful while working through the complex emotions surrounding my decision to disappear from Whitney's life without explanation or dramatic confrontation. I found genuine satisfaction in measuring twice and cutting once, in sanding rough edges until they became smooth, in applying stain that brought out the natural grain patterns hidden within ordinary pieces of lumber, and the methodical nature of the craft helped me understand that some things require patience and careful attention to detail rather than constant emotional intensity and crisis management. My astronomy photography hobby connected me with a group of people who appreciated the quiet dedication required to capture images of distant galaxies and nebulae, spending hours in comfortable silence under star-filled skies while waiting for the perfect shot, and I realized that this peaceful, contemplative approach to relationships felt much healthier than the constant emotional firefighting I'd been doing for Whitney. Within 3 weeks of implementing my communication blackout, I started receiving messages from Whitney through mutual friends, increasingly frantic attempts to understand why I'd suddenly vanished from her life without warning or explanation, and I could hear the genuine panic in her voice when Sarah called to relay Whitney's concerns about my sudden disappearance and her fear that something terrible had happened to me. The messages escalated from casual check-ins to desperate pleas for contact, especially when Jackson predictably became emotionally unavailable after their third date, started borrowing money for his art projects, and began posting cryptic Instagram stories about needing space to focus on his creative process, leaving Whitney without her usual romantic excitement and simultaneously discovering that her emotional support system had completely evaporated. I felt completely detached from her crisis, treating her increasingly desperate attempts to reach me like spam messages from a stranger, and I realized that the brother she'd never had was experiencing his first taste of genuine independence from her emotional needs and demands. When friends tried to guilt me into responding to her messages, explaining that she was going through a difficult time and really needed someone to talk to, I simply told them that I was focusing on my own life and personal growth, which was true but didn't capture the profound sense of liberation I felt every morning when I woke up without dreading the possibility of my day being hijacked by someone else's romantic disasters. 3 months into my new life, I attended a community workshop on sustainable urban planning that focused on integrating green infrastructure with existing city systems, something directly related to my work but also personally fascinating because it combined environmental science with the practical engineering challenges I dealt with every day. The workshop was held at the Downtown Environmental Center, and I'd arrived early to review the materials when I noticed a woman setting up a detailed presentation about using native plant landscapes to manage stormwater runoff in residential areas. She was tall with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing work boots and jeans that suggested someone who actually spent time outdoors implementing the projects she designed. And when she began her presentation about landscape architecture as a tool for environmental restoration, I found myself genuinely engaged in a way I hadn't experienced since my college classes. Her name was Kendra, and she spoke with the kind of passionate expertise that comes from years of hands-on experience rather than purely academic knowledge, explaining how properly designed green spaces could reduce flooding, improve air quality, and create wildlife corridors that connected fragmented urban ecosystems. During the break, I approached her to ask about the specific plant species she'd recommended for our city's climate zone, and we ended up in a 40-minute conversation about soil composition, drainage patterns, and the intersection of municipal planning with ecological restoration that felt like the most intellectually stimulating discussion I'd had in years. Kendra listened to my questions about infrastructure integration with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance, asking follow-up questions about permit processes and budget allocation that demonstrated she understood the practical challenges of implementing environmental projects within existing bureaucratic systems. When I mentioned my work coordinating infrastructure projects for the city, her eyes lit up with excitement rather than glazing over with boredom, and she immediately started discussing potential collaboration opportunities between our departments that could benefit both municipal efficiency and environmental sustainability. We exchanged contact information at the end of the workshop, ostensibly to share professional resources and discuss future project possibilities, but I found myself looking forward to continuing our conversation in a way that felt completely different from the obligatory social interactions I'd grown accustomed to during my years of Whitney management. Our first official meeting was scheduled as a working lunch to discuss a potential pilot program for bioswale installation along major city corridors, but it quickly evolved into a 3-hour conversation that covered everything from professional goals to personal philosophies about work-life balance, environmental responsibility, and the importance of building something meaningful rather than just pursuing immediate gratification. Kendra had the rare ability to listen actively and contribute thoughtfully to discussions, asking questions that demonstrated genuine curiosity about my perspectives while sharing her own experiences and insights in a way that felt like genuine intellectual partnership rather than performative conversation designed to impress or manipulate. When she mentioned her weekend plans to visit a restored prairie preserve outside the city, I found myself asking if she'd be interested in company, explaining that I'd recently gotten into astronomy photography and had been looking for dark sky locations away from urban light pollution. She immediately connected my hobby with her conservation work, suggesting that documenting the night sky above restored ecosystems could provide valuable data about light pollution impacts on wildlife while creating beautiful images that might inspire public support for environmental protection efforts. Our relationship developed naturally through shared interests and mutual respect, with conversations that flowed in both directions rather than me serving as a one-way emotional dumping ground. And I realized that this was what partnership actually felt like when both people contributed equally to the dynamic instead of one person constantly managing the other's emotional crises. When Whitney managed to contact me through her cousin's phone number, sending desperate messages about finally understanding her mistakes and begging for another chance to rebuild our friendship, I showed the text to Kendra and asked her opinion about whether I should respond. Kendra read the message thoughtfully, then looked at me with the kind of clear-eyed assessment I'd come to appreciate, and told me that anyone who needed to lose someone completely before recognizing their value probably hadn't learned anything meaningful about relationships, just about consequences. I blocked that number too, feeling completely at peace with the decision because I'd found genuine partnership built on equality rather than dependency, and I understood finally that the right person would treasure my thoughtful nature and planning-oriented approach to life rather than taking it for granted while searching for more exciting alternatives. 4 months into my relationship with Kendra, We attended our mutual friend Tyler's engagement party at a trendy rooftop bar downtown, the kind of place with exposed brick walls and industrial lighting that attracted young professionals who wanted to feel sophisticated while drinking overpriced cocktails and networking with people in their industry. I'd been looking forward to introducing Kendra to my extended social circle, partly because I was genuinely proud to be with someone so accomplished and interesting, but also because I knew word would eventually get back to Whitney about my new relationship status, and I wanted that information to come through natural social channels rather than dramatic confrontation. We'd been standing near the bar discussing Tyler's choice of venue with a group of his coworkers when I spotted Whitney across the crowded rooftop, and the shock of seeing her after 4 months of complete separation hit me like ice water, even though I'd mentally prepared for this possibility. She looked different than I remembered, thinner and somehow diminished, wearing a dress that seemed too formal for the casual atmosphere and checking her phone with the nervous frequency of someone who wasn't entirely comfortable in social situations without her usual emotional support system. The moment our eyes met across the crowded space, her face went through a rapid sequence of expressions that I could read like subtitles on a foreign film, starting with surprise, moving through recognition, then settling into something that looked like genuine shock as she processed the sight of my arm around another woman's waist in a gesture of casual intimacy she'd never witnessed during our 6 years of friendship. I watched her freeze completely, her cocktail glass suspended halfway to her lips while she stared at Kendra and me with the kind of stunned disbelief people show when their fundamental assumptions about reality get suddenly overturned. And I realized that Whitney had never seriously considered the possibility that I might find someone else who appreciated the qualities she'd dismissed as boring and predictable. Kendra noticed my change in demeanor and followed my gaze across the rooftop, immediately understanding the situation without requiring detailed explanation because we'd discussed Whitney enough times for her to recognize the small blonde woman whose face had gone pale with what looked like existential panic. Whitney began making her way through the crowd toward us with the determined expression of someone about to reclaim territory they'd assumed would always be available, and I felt Kendra's hand tighten slightly on my arm in a gesture of solidarity rather than possessiveness, which perfectly captured the difference between secure partnership and desperate territorial behavior. When Whitney reached our group, she inserted herself into the conversation with practiced social skills, immediately introducing herself as my oldest and closest friend while extending her hand to Kendra with a smile that looked genuine but felt calculated, designed to establish dominance through the implied intimacy of long history and shared memories. I watched this performance with detached curiosity rather than anxiety, understanding that Whitney was trying to assert her primacy in my life through the kind of social maneuvering she'd probably learned from romantic comedies and women's magazines, but I felt no obligation to help her maintain face or smooth over the awkwardness she was creating. Instead, I responded to her introduction by putting my other arm around Kendra and telling the group that Kendra was my best friend and the most important person in my life, a statement that was both true and strategically devastating because it completely reversed the power dynamic Whitney had been trying to establish. The way I said it, calm and matter-of-fact rather than defensive or aggressive, made it clear that this wasn't a competition or a declaration of war, just a simple statement of current reality that happened to contradict Whitney's assumptions about her permanent place in my emotional hierarchy. I watched her face process this information, seeing the exact moment when she understood that the reliable foundation she'd counted on for 6 years had not only disappeared but had been transferred to someone else who'd earned it through reciprocal care and genuine appreciation rather than taking it for granted while pursuing more exciting options. The conversation continued around us, but Whitney seemed unable to participate meaningfully, her usual social confidence replaced by visible distress as she watched Kendra and me interact with the kind of easy intimacy that comes from actually knowing and liking each other rather than serving predefined roles in an unbalanced emotional economy. When Tyler approached our group to thank everyone for coming and mentioned that he and his fiancée were planning a destination wedding in Costa Rica, Whitney seized the opportunity to ask me about my travel plans, probably hoping to re-establish some kind of personal connection, but I responded by discussing the photography workshop Kendra and I were planning to attend in the Pacific Northwest, making it clear that my future adventures involved someone who shared my interests rather than someone who needed constant emotional management. After an hour of watching me treat her like a casual acquaintance while demonstrating genuine affection and respect for another woman, Whitney's composure finally cracked completely, and she excused herself to the bathroom with tears in her eyes and her phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline, leaving Kendra and me to continue enjoying the party with people who actually wanted to be there. The final confrontation happened 3 weeks later at the bookstore cafe where I'd started spending my lunch breaks, a quiet place with comfortable chairs and the kind of atmosphere that encouraged reading rather than conversation, and I was sitting near the window reviewing project proposals when Whitney appeared at my table with the determined expression of someone who'd rehearsed this encounter multiple times. She looked better than she had at Tyler's party, more put together and confident, wearing the kind of carefully chosen outfit that suggested she'd prepared for this meeting like a job interview, and I realized that our brief interaction at the rooftop bar had probably triggered weeks of emotional processing and strategic planning. She asked if she could sit down, explaining that she'd been hoping to run into me somewhere neutral where we could have an honest conversation without the social pressure and witnesses that had made our last encounter so awkward and painful. I gestured to the empty chair across from me with the kind of polite resignation you'd show to a persistent salesperson, understanding that this conversation was probably inevitable and deciding to let her say whatever she'd come to say rather than trying to avoid it or cut her off before she could begin. Whitney launched into what was clearly a carefully prepared speech about personal growth, self-reflection, and the mistakes she'd made during our friendship, explaining that losing me had forced her to examine her behavior patterns and recognize how she'd taken my loyalty and support for granted while pursuing relationships that ultimately proved shallow and unsatisfying. She talked about therapy sessions where she discussed our dynamic, describing how her counselor had helped her understand that she'd been using me as an emotional security blanket while denying herself the possibility of genuine romantic connection with someone who actually knew and cared about her as a complete person. The way she presented it, our entire 6-year friendship had been a tragic misunderstanding caused by her fear of intimacy and commitment, her tendency to compartmentalize relationships into safe versus exciting categories, and her inability to recognize that the most meaningful partnerships often grow from solid foundations of friendship and mutual respect. She admitted that watching me with Kendra at the party had been a revelation, seeing me interact with someone who appreciated my thoughtful nature and planning-oriented approach to life rather than taking it for granted, and she claimed that witnessing our obvious compatibility had made her realize what she'd been missing all along. Whitney's voice cracked slightly as she confessed that she'd been in love with me for years but had convinced herself that romantic feelings would complicate our friendship, that she'd needed to explore other options before she could appreciate what we already had, and that losing me completely had finally forced her to acknowledge the depth of her feelings and the magnitude of her mistake. She reached across the table to touch my hand while explaining that she understood now why I'd disappeared from her life, that she didn't blame me for protecting myself from further emotional damage, but that she hoped we could find a way to rebuild something genuine and honest based on mutual romantic interest rather than the unbalanced dynamic that had characterized our previous relationship. The performance was impressive in its apparent sincerity, complete with tears and vulnerability and what seemed like genuine remorse for the pain she'd caused, but I found myself analyzing her words with the same detached curiosity I'd used to evaluate a budget proposal that looked good on paper but contained fundamental flaws in its underlying assumptions. When she finished her emotional appeal and looked at me expectantly, waiting for some sign that her confession had achieved its intended effect, I let the silence stretch for a long moment before responding with the calm, measured tone I'd learned to use when delivering disappointing news to city council members who'd proposed unrealistic projects. I thanked her for the honesty and acknowledged that it probably took courage to seek me out and share her feelings so openly, but I explained that I was genuinely happy with Kendra and had no interest in revisiting our previous dynamic or exploring romantic possibilities that should have been considered years earlier when they might have meant something significant. Whitney's face went through the familiar sequence of expressions I remembered from our coffee shop rejection scene, starting with disbelief, moving through negotiation mode, and finally settling into the kind of desperate panic that comes from realizing that carefully planned strategies sometimes fail completely. She asked if we could at least try to be friends again, explaining that she missed our conversations and emotional connection even if romantic reconciliation wasn't possible, and I could see her mentally recalculating her approach based on my obvious lack of interest in her romantic revelation. I looked at her sitting across from me in the bookstore cafe, this person who'd been such a central figure in my life for so many years, and I felt nothing but a distant fondness mixed with genuine sympathy for someone who'd finally realized the value of something after losing it permanently. I told her that I appreciated her desire to reconnect, but that I'd moved on to a different kind of relationship that met my emotional needs in ways our friendship never had, and that I looked forward to maintaining the sibling-like connection she'd always wanted us to have. The word sibling hung in the air between us like a perfectly aimed dart, and I watched Whitney understand that I was using her own language against her, trapping her in the exact category she'd created to keep me safely contained outside the realm of romantic possibility. I stood up from the table and gathered my project materials, then looked down at her with a warm smile and called her sis before walking away toward the exit, leaving her sitting alone at the table with the family's own label she'd spent 6 years reinforcing now applied with perfect irony to her own situation.